In the 21st century, the core of what it means to be an American remains the idea that no one is more equal than anyone else. That we are all born with the same natural rights, and that we are entitled to have that equality of rights recognized. Yet equal rights for all is still far from a reality. Just as it was when America declared independence from Britain over 235 years ago. Declared its independence with that preeminent manifesto of natural rights, the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration states that this nation's very reason for coming into existence is so that every person within it can be free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. The Founding Fathers made this declaration, knowing full well that at that time most blacks were slaves, and women were granted far fewer rights than men. The history of equal rights in America is the story of the nation's ongoing struggle to make its founding ideals a reality for all the people. It is the story of a steady movement, led first by women toward equality, a story of equality for women, minorities, workers, the unemployed, the poor, the elderly, and the disabled. It is a story of both setbacks and of great triumphs. It is a story told in the uniquely American setting. But at the same time, it is a broader story. A story of human beings striving to be free. Free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness.
Hello, I'm Rosa Vasquez, and welcome to the first episode of A History of Equal Rights in America. During the first 50 years of our history, the idea that all people in this new nation were equal, regardless of their gender, wealth, or education, was just that, an idea. At that time, America's power and wealth rested in the hands of a few property-owning white males. But that changed as the nation expanded westward. Out of necessity, the common man was given the ability to easily acquire property. And as we shall see, from that single change arose a new consciousness that allowed like-minded people to join together around social and political causes. Even before the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, Founding Father Samuel Adams understood that while it was important to protect the rights and freedoms of the individual, it was also critical that the structure of American society make it possible for individuals to freely form groups that were free from government intervention.
Throughout America's long history, there have always been disadvantaged groups. Groups with lesser access to the corridors of political power. And most importantly, less access to economic resources. They include women, blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, gays, the disabled, the sick, and of course, the poor. The drive to create relief from discrimination against these groups goes back to an idea an idea that sparked the American Revolution. It is an idea that was expressed in Samuel Adams' 1772 essay entitled The Rights of the Colonists. The idea of the natural rights of man, rights that come not from government, but from nature or God. Rights that were written 4 years later into the Declaration of Independence. Born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1722, Samuel Adams was an American through and through. Indeed, along with Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and his cousin John Adams, Samuel Adams was one of the godfathers of the American Revolution. In 1765, Adams founded the Sons of Liberty, a secret colonial society whose purpose was to organize patriotic action and shape public opinion against Britain. Adams, a true believer in the cause of liberty and freedom, was the most renowned firebrand of the American Revolution. A powerful writer, he disseminated his ideas in correspondence that circulated throughout the colonies. The most famous was the Circular Letter, written in 1768. An essential, unalterable right in nature, that what man hath freely and honestly acquired is absolutely his own, which he may freely give, but cannot be taken from him without his consent. Then in 1772, Samuel Adams wrote The Rights of the Colonists, a work that would lay out the foundation for American equal rights for the next 240 years. The pamphlet opened with these stirring words: "Among the natural rights of the colonists are these. First, a right to life. Secondly, to liberty. Thirdly, to property." In the next paragraph, Sam Adams defined equal rights. All men have a right to remain in a state of nature as long as they please, and in case of intolerable oppression, civil or religious, to leave the society they belong to and enter into another. When men enter into society, it is by voluntary consent, and they have a right to demand and insist upon the performance of such conditions and previous limitations as form an equitable original compact. Insisting on this equitable compact for anyone to move freely in all facets of America's civil society without discrimination is what equal rights is all about. It started with rich white male colonists, and by the 21st century, it had been extended, in part at least, to women, blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, gays, disabled, and the poor.
2 years after Britain ignored Samuel Adams' The Rights of the Colonists, the American colonists declared their independence, declared it in the stirring phrases of the world's preeminent manifesto of equal rights, the Declaration of Independence.
Today it is celebrated with great fanfare every July 4th. It is Independence Day for nearly 300 million Americans. However, unlike most revolutions, America's Independence Day celebrates not a bloody battle or the overthrow of a malevolent dictator or monarch. The American Independence Day celebrates an intellectual document, the Declaration of Independence. This document was the defining moment of American political thought and philosophy that American colonists had been striving toward since the French and Indian War. By the spring of 1776, Opposition to American independence centered in the middle colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. By the time the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia State House that June, the only question concerning independence left before the representatives was the timing. Should they wait for a groundswell from the people? Thomas Jefferson argued that Congress should act immediately.
The people wait for us to lead the way.
The representatives agreed that Congress should wait 3 weeks while delegates from the mid-Atlantic colonies shored up support for independence. Meanwhile, Congress appointed a committee led by Thomas Jefferson to write the document. By July 1st, they had a document that began with soaring phrases now taught to every American student. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 1st, the committee presented the document to Congress. Representatives debated it for 4 days. Little was changed except that a long passage which blamed Negro slavery on the king was eliminated. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence passed with no negative votes recorded against it. The 13 colonies unanimously declared themselves independent of Great Britain. The celebration began as it was read to a throng of people outside of the State House. Great celebrations of joy followed throughout the colonies, but the war had still to be won.
While the Founding Fathers declared that every man had the right to life, liberty, and happiness, they had firmly in mind the right to property, that each person was entitled to the economic independence that flowed from land ownership. Land ownership that, since the founding of the colonies, had been restricted to a privileged few. That would have to change if America was going to settle her vast territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. And it did change. In doing so, it changed the nature of what America would become, a country with a large, successful middle class.
'18th century America was a unique and wonderful place. Here, for the first time in history, was a country where anyone could settle and acquire land. And in doing so, put himself on the road to equality with the privileged classes, the elite, the aristocracy. With this idea in mind, America's colonists fought and won a revolution in order to preserve this equality. In his 1772 pamphlet, The Rights of the Colonists, Samuel Adams captured for the first time the foundation underlying American equality with these electrifying words. Among the natural rights of the colonists are these: a right to property. The right to property, the right to own land, was the most fundamental right envisioned by America's founding fathers. To men like Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin, owning land meant not only power, but something more fundamental: equality. Land ownership made people equal. Before the American Revolution, land ownership was based on the English feudal system. The king owned all the land and allowed others to use it in exchange for service. Then, after the Revolution, this power shifted to the states and the federal government. The states were responsible for the land within their borders, while the federal government was responsible for the vast territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now any newcomer to America could settle land and make it his own. It was a momentous breakthrough in the rights of man, in moving toward true equality. With all this new land ready for pioneers heading west to settle and gain ownership, the question arose of how to divide it up fairly. The answer came from one of America's greatest champions of equality, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wrote the Land Ordinance of 1784, calling for the territory west of the Appalachians to be divided into separate states, with the land open to everyone to settle and buy. His proposal was part of his vision for America: an agrarian paradise with an educated yeoman farmer class working their own farms. Every man equal because he owned his own property. So at Jefferson's urging, the government enacted two momentous laws: the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, to help settle this virgin territory. Interestingly, these two ordinances were perhaps the most significant acts ever passed by the fledgling United States government. They held out the promise to all Americans of owning land, the gold standard for economic equality, as well as membership in what had once been an exclusive club of the ultra-rich and the aristocracy. Slowly, America began expanding that membership from white men to women to ethnic minorities.
The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were to guarantee rights against the national and state governments. But the First Amendment also affirmatively guaranteed the right of the people to assemble, a right that was interpreted to mean that individuals could associate together for political and social change, a right that would prove absolutely essential to this nation's movement toward equal rights.
When the Founding Fathers met here in Philadelphia's Independence Hall to create a new federal government for the United States, all the delegates understood that such a step was necessary. But how much power that government should have was much debated. Having won a war which gave them freedom, the right to own property, and the right of self-government, the question remained: what could they do to ensure that each successive generation of Americans would also have those same rights and freedoms? They wanted the rights of the people protected. They wanted these rights, such as the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech and press, and protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, written down and made part of the nation's governing document. As stated in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Anti-Federalists insisted upon a Declaration of Rights that derived not from government, but instead were the natural rights of all the people independent of the government. To satisfy these concerns and ensure ratification of the new Constitution, a Bill of Rights, a Declaration of Human Rights, or as they are now called, Fundamental Civil Rights, was promised. In the summer of 1788, a proposed draft of the Bill of Rights was circulated among the states. Many of these fundamental rights derived from abuses of power that the colonists suffered under oppressive British rule. In 1690, the first colonial newspaper, Boston's Public Occurrences, was suppressed after one issue. In 1760, Founding Father James Otis argued against illegal searches conducted by British soldiers. From 1765 throughout the Revolutionary War, colonists were forced against their will to house these same soldiers in their homes. In 1775, British troops marched on Lexington and Concord to confiscate colonial arms and ammunition. British authorities did not always allow colonists the same rights of due process or speedy trials that Englishmen were guaranteed. And colonists faced excessive bails and cruel and unusual punishments. With the proposed Bill of Rights, most of the Anti-Federalists were satisfied that the people's fundamental rights would be safeguarded. Since their adoption, these amendments have done their job. Americans in the 21st century still have as much freedom and as many rights, perhaps even more, than the Founding Fathers.
In America, the uneducated have always been one of the nation's largest marginalized groups. Horace Mann's solution was universal public education.
The 19th century one-room schoolhouse on the prairie stands as a testament to America's understanding of the importance of universal education. Equal education for all. Americans knew that only by a common experience of reading, of mathematics, of science, of history, and in particular, a common experience of social and moral values, could the country produce enlightened citizens capable of self-government. Americans knew that universal education was the great leveler, the great equalizer of the playing field for its marginalized citizens, ethnic minorities, and women. However, fulfilling this realization didn't come easily. It started with an educational visionary who was born in Massachusetts at the turn of the 19th century. His name was Horace Mann, and he is considered to be the father of America's public school system. Before Mann's revolutionary vision, education was largely the right of the wealthy, particularly children of rich white property owners. Children of less fortunate parents were largely educated by mothers as best they could, and blacks weren't educated at all. But in 1838, Horace Mann changed that when he put forth his principles of public education. 1. The public should no longer remain ignorant. 2. That such education should be paid for, controlled, and sustained by an interested public. 3. That this education will be best provided in schools that embrace children from a variety of backgrounds. 4. That this education must be non-sectarian. 5. That this education must be taught by the spirit, method, and discipline of a free society. And 6. That education should be provided by well-trained professional teachers. These principles have served America well. Yet extending them to include everyone has not come easily. In fact, their implementation produced some of the most heated civil and equal rights conflicts in the nation's history. In 1954, the Supreme Court's decision known as Brown v. Board of Education, the decision abolishing equal but separate schools for blacks, is still reverberating through the nation. Then, in 1957, the integration of blacks into Little Rock, Arkansas's Central High School caused President Eisenhower to call in the National Guard to protect students. And 5 years later, President Kennedy again mobilized the National Guard to enable black Air Force veteran James Meredith to register at Ole Miss University in Oxford, Mississippi. Quotas for minorities and Jews in America's greatest institutions of higher learning, such as Harvard and Yale, did not fall until the latter part of the 20th century. And of course, It took until 1969 for the prestigious Princeton University to admit women. And even in the 21st century, with all of its technological advances for making knowledge free and available to everyone, America has not fully realized Horace Mann's vision of a universally enlightened citizenry.
From the beginning of the nation, women such as Abigail Adams, wife of the second President of the United States, knew that a great injustice had been done when the rights of women were not specifically mentioned in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution. Hello, I'm Rosa Vasquez. In the second episode of A History of Equal Rights in America, we begin the long journey in the struggle for equal rights. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was the American social norm to assume that women could not excel in higher education in subjects such as mathematics, physics, and astronomy. Mary Lyons debunked that assumption once and for all.
In modern America, women are a part of the landscape of nearly every college and university, from private institutions like Harvard and Princeton, to land-grant colleges like Colorado State University and Washington State University, to the East Coast's elite Seven Sisters schools, including Vassar, Wellesley, and Mount Holyoke. But it wasn't always so. 175 years ago, women could not attend any universities. Then, one woman changed higher education in America. That woman was Mary Lyon, and in 1837, she established the first institution of higher learning for women, Mount Holyoke College. By the end of the 18th century, American women had established a unique identity based on intelligence, self-reliance, and the challenges of living on an ever-changing North American frontier. Women of the Revolutionary War era, such as Abigail Adams and Judith Sargent Murray, argued that women were as intelligent and capable as men and deserved the same opportunities, especially in education. Yet, in spite of their abilities, women were denied the right to vote, the right to enter the professions, and most importantly, the right to a higher education. This was about to change. As the 19th century dawned in the United States of America, the growing middle and upper classes in cities such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were becoming more sophisticated. The result was that many women were unhappy just being housewives. They wanted to participate in all the opportunities available in America, and in order to do this, they would need an education that went beyond reading, writing, and simple mathematics. If women were going to get the education they needed in order to enter the professions, they would have to do it on their own. They would have to build their own universities and colleges. In 1837, Mount Holyoke Female Seminary's inaugural class of 80 women attended courses in philosophy, mathematics, biology, and literature. The curriculum matched that of elite men's colleges such as Harvard and Yale. Remembering her own struggle to pay for higher education, Lyon made tuition at Mount Holyoke only $60 a year. News of the college spread, and the next year, 200 women applied for the class's 90 seats. Mount Holyoke Female Seminary was the first women's college to offer rigorous courses and to demand excellence from its graduates. Others followed, and a system of women's colleges known as the Seven Sisters arose. Mount Holyoke, Vassar, Smith, Wellesley, Barnard, Radcliffe, and Bryn Mawr. By the end of the century, the admission of women to women's colleges and regular universities and colleges increased dramatically. In 1870, 1/5 of students were women. By 1900, it was 1/3. And by the start of the 21st century, women earned 57% of undergraduate, 59% of master's, and 46% of doctoral degrees. Mary Lyon served as the principal of Mount Holyoke for 12 years, improving and expanding the curriculum. She died in 1849. Her model for women creating institutions to service and foster their own needs and to develop their own opportunities continues to the present day. As for Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, in 1895, it became Mount Holyoke College. Its tradition of excellence has continued into the 21st century. Mount Holyoke students include Congresswoman and Connecticut Governor Ellen T. Grasso, Emily Dickinson, and Pulitzer Prize winner Susan Laurie Parks. They are all a part of Mary Lyon's legacy as the trailblazer of women's higher education.
Early in the 19th century, American women saw that we could not achieve economic and social equality until we were allowed to own land in our own right. In the next 2 chapters, we will learn the story of how women came to be landowners.
America's great cities were established by visionaries who conceived them as settlements for trade, farming, and raising families. In 1681, William Penn founded Philadelphia for the Quakers. In 1772, Black entrepreneur Jean Dusable started Chicago as a commercial trading post. And in 1836, Juana Briones transformed San Francisco from an isolated fort into the West Coast's most important city. Juana Briones was born about 1802 near Santa Cruz, California. At this time, California was an outpost of the Spanish Empire. Her father had been in the expedition that founded a military garrison on San Francisco Bay in 1776. Juana grew up near the fort. In 1822, she married a cavalryman stationed at the fort. However, Juana's husband turned out to be an abusive drunk, and in 1836, she left her husband and moved to Yerba Buena. In 1843, Juana purchased for $300 a 4,442-acre parcel in the Palo Alto Hills. Still standing today is her wood-framed adobe brick house. Juana single-handedly pioneered the land. She established the first farm and sold milk and produce to the ships that anchored in San Francisco Bay. She ran a tavern and practiced midwifery and herbal healing among the Indians and settlers. The beach where she sold her produce became known as La Playa de Juana Briones. Most importantly, she welcomed settlers, and she transformed Yerba Buena from an isolated settlement into a thriving town. A town that would later become San Francisco. However, when California became part of the United States and gained its statehood in 1850, Briones and her Hispanic contemporaries were required to certify their land ownership before the U.S. Land Commission. This legal process included a number of hurdles for all Mexican landholders, but especially for women. But Briones hired an astute lawyer and navigated the court system carefully and precisely. Her legal battle for property ownership ultimately made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In winning her case, she established a powerful precedent for women's rights to own and control property. Juana Briones died around 1890, one of California's wealthiest women. On October 9, 1997, the city of San Francisco erected a plaque in the Washington Square district honoring her service to the community and her humanitarianism.
For the man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake.
At the founding of America at the beginning of the 17th century, the accepted social, religious, and economic belief among colonial men was that women were inferior. They were incapable of owning land, running businesses, or participating in government. The result was that for the next 250 years, American women played a backseat role to men in the struggle for equal rights. This would all change with a momentous piece of state legislation in 1848. New York's Married Women's Property Act would set women directly on the path to equality with men. The bill was passed because of the substantial efforts of Ernestine Rose, a Jewish intellectual who would go on to become a voice of the women's movement, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would lead the women's suffrage movement. The new law read in part, "The real and personal property of any female who may hereafter marry, and which she shall own at the time of marriage, and the rents, issues, and profits thereof, shall not be subject to the disposal of her husband, nor be liable for his debts, and shall continue her sole and separate property as if she were a single female." For feminists, the ability for married women to own their own property was a giant leap forward on the road to equality with men. Indeed, it was the greatest step forward for women's equal rights in the first 60 years of the American Republic. In the 1850s, other states followed New York's lead. Thanks to the efforts of feminist Mary Farren, Massachusetts passed a Married Women's Property Act in 1854. And by 1900, every state in the Union had given married women substantial control over their property.
If women were going to create a true equal rights movement, they could not rely on others to rally the public. They needed a voice of their own. Amelia Bloomer gave them that voice.
It was a bold and unprecedented experiment, a magazine by a woman for women. But the Lily magazine wasn't founded during the women's movement in the 1970s. It was founded in 1849 by Amelia Bloomer. The Lily became a voice for women's issues nearly 125 years before the founding of Ms. Magazine, and gave women their first national voice. Since the 1820s, women in America had participated in reform movements, addressing such societal ills as slavery and the poor treatment of criminals and the insane. During this period, they also began to agitate for the same opportunities democracy offered to men. Then, in 1848, at the first Women's Rights Convention held at Seneca Falls, New York, women voiced their political demands. Here, they wrote a Declaration of Women's Rights that closed with the demand that women have the immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. Now all that was needed was a national vehicle that would take their views to the people. Attending the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls was Amelia Bloomer. She met with women's rights activists such as Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Later, Bloomer introduced Stanton to fellow suffragist Susan B. Anthony. Encouraged by Stanton and Anthony, Bloomer started her own bi-weekly magazine, The Lily, a ladies' journal devoted to temperance and literature, in January 1849. It was like no magazine the country had ever seen. The Lily, with its distinctly feminine style, tackled women's issues such as suffrage, temperance, marriage law reform, and higher education. Circulation quickly reached 4,000. The magazine galvanized support for equal rights from the East to the Great Plains and gave women a unique forum to explore their own identity. For Amelia Bloomer, that exploration also meant loosening the constrictions in women's dress. Tightly laced corsets, petticoats, and floor-length dresses made it impossible for women to move or work comfortably. In 1851, Bloomer began publishing articles advocating short dresses, loose bodices, and even women's trousers. Her trousers quickly became known as bloomers. Bloomer published The Lily for 6 years. After the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920, more women's magazines sprang up, such as the Ladies' Home Journal, focusing on women's social, educational, and health issues. And in the mid-1970s, Ms. Magazine brought feminism to a wide readership. Then, 150 years after The Lily stopped publication, the Oxygen Channel arrived on cable television as the first network with programming devoted to women. As they had in the 19th century, women in the 21st continue to build their own institutions to voice their concerns, opinions, and ideas.
While American women were shaping a powerful equal rights movement, blacks saw that they too needed their own equal rights movement. And they saw that this movement would only succeed if they had access to higher educational opportunities.
In the 21st century, black professionals are a common part of the fabric of American life, from medicine to business, from entertainment to teaching. Blacks share in the country's standard of living, the highest standard of living on the planet. In addition, the black middle class has expanded during the second half of the 20th century. All of this because of the courage and foresight of many unknown and unheralded blacks in the middle of the 19th century. From the earliest days of the new nation, enlightened citizens knew the only way to liberty, equality, and true democracy was education for all. And for a long time, blacks had to supply that opportunity for themselves. Denied entry into white schools, they sought basic schooling through alternative avenues. Then in 1854, near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Lincoln University opened its doors, still growing today with its new motto, producing leaders to shape a new millennium. It would be the first of many black colleges and universities. In the 4 decades following emancipation and the end of the Civil War, and without access to great financial resources, blacks amassed and contributed more than $40 million for the education of their children. By 1900, there were 28,500 black teachers, 1.5 million black children in schools, and 34 black colleges and universities. In the 20th century, the pace of black higher education accelerated even more. As for Lincoln University, during the school's first century, its graduates made up 20% of all black doctors and 10% of all lawyers. Its alumni include Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and literary giant Langston Hughes. In truly American fashion, blacks, through their own hard work, have become scientists, educators, lawyers, and doctors, as Lincoln University's motto states, shaping the new millennium.
During the Civil War, Northerners sought to settle the Great Plains. settle this open land with abolitionist-minded pioneers. Through the passage of the Homestead Act of 1862, Congress declared that it was willing to grant land ownership to women if they were willing to work the soil. And they did.
On a spot near this log cabin, settler Daniel Freeman successfully filed the first claim to acquire free land under the historic 1862 Homestead Act. Freeman's claim marked the beginning of the last wave of pioneer immigration in America, a wave that would settle the Great Plains. It was an extension of the American ideal of equality, equality based on private ownership of the land. It also marked a radical paradigm shift. It did not discriminate against women. 14 years earlier, New York State had passed the first ever act that allowed married women to hold land in their own name. But once women had passed the legal hurdle, could they pass the cultural hurdle? Could they go out and actually homestead their own land? With the 1862 Homestead Act, that barrier fell. The Homestead Act was passed during the American Civil War. The war fought to settle the question of slavery in America. Northern abolitionists wanted to bring in settlers, known as free soilers, to ensure that the Plains states were free of slavery. The Homestead Act gave applicants freehold title to up to 160 acres of undeveloped federal land, as long as they followed 3 steps. 1. Filed an application. 2. Improved the land. And 3. Filed for deed of title. But in the fight for equal rights for women, the 1862 Act demonstrated for the first time that the federal government did not use gender as one of the criteria for land ownership. Section 1 of the Act read, "Head of a family, or who has arrived at the age of 21 years and is a citizen of the United States, shall be entitled to enter 1/4 section or a less quantity of unappropriated public lands, and that he or she is the head of a family." It did not take women long to seize the opportunity to prove they could homestead land as well as any man. For example, the 4 Chrisman sisters homesteaded over 1,000 acres of land near Homestead National Monument in eastern Nebraska. In all, thousands of women took the opportunity to homestead over the next 100 years, putting women on the road to the economic equality they deserved.
After the Civil War, the women's equal rights movement grew in strength, although the struggle was to be long. At that same time, the nation's rapid industrialization produced a new kind of equal rights movement, the labor movement. These stories and more in the 3rd episode of A History of Equal Rights in America. Thanks for watching. I'm Rosa Vasquez.